Thank you very much, Mark. Given my current handicap, I haven't put together any slides for this short presentation of mine, which means that if you're interested in reading more about the things that I will say, there's a wonderful last chapter in the book which I co-authored with Warren. We've left outside, there were a few flyers that allow you to get a discount on the pretty heavy price tag that the book comes with. If you're not willing to part with the cash, most of the chapters are actually available free of charge on the IBD website as working papers. What I'm going to do is give you a flavor. I shouldn't have said that, shouldn't I? What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about some of the more general lessons that we drew from this work that we did looking at these 6 organizations that Mark has summarized, and also talk about some other ideas that we sort of captured in the briefing paper that is also available on the table outside, looking at what are some of the implications of this work for donor agencies that are interested in supporting civil society budget work. So first of all, what are some of the wider findings and lessons that we felt were important to draw from this set of 6 case studies, again with no claim for generalizability, given the fact that this was mostly about learning lessons in terms of what new civil society groups that are wanting to engage in civil society budget monitoring and advocacy, what can they learn from these 6 groups that have been active in this area for a number of years, and what are some of the lessons, again, for organizations such as donor agencies or foundations that are interested in supporting this kind of work around the world. So there's 5 main lessons that I'm going to focus on. The first one, which we found very encouraging, was the fact that civil society budget work is possible not only in a wide variety of environments, but also for a wide variety of institutions, the different types of institutions, and using a wide variety of approaches. So this was encouraging in the sense that it led us to think that budget work is actually possible much further beyond the 6 countries and the 6 organizations that we looked at. First of all, diversity of environments. The countries that we looked at included middle-income countries and low-income countries. They included countries that had just come out of very important political transitions, South Africa from apartheid, Croatia from a former socialist system, even Brazil, it had not been long since the end of the dictatorship, which, again, sort of we thought was an encouraging finding. The second one is that we looked at different kinds of institutions. Some of these organizations were more academically oriented research institutes. Some of them were mass-based social movements. Some of them were networks of organizations that sort of coalesced around a common area of interest. And finally, the diversity of approaches that these organizations utilize. Some of them focus heavily on, for example, training other civil society organizations in using budget information. Some of them try to build coalitions of partners working in a very specific issue area. Some of them decided to target very specifically some government actors and pretty much only talk to them, trying to influence their policy-making decisions. And this all sort of depended on the kinds of strengths and weaknesses that they had, depending on the type of organization that they were, but also on the identification of very clear entry points in terms of how the budget process worked and what opportunities it allowed in terms of participation and influence. The second wider lesson had to do with the fact that it was much easier, actually. We saw many more examples of influence on budget transparency and budget participation, some of the issues, the process issues that Mark covered in the second one of his key findings. Then we actually saw of examples in changes in budget policies and, say, hard allocation of public resources. Now, this is not very surprising. It's much easier for a civil society organization to simply take budget information, repackage it in a way that is much more user-friendly, disseminate it, organize training courses, and so promote knowledge and, say, citizen engagement with the budget process, than it is, of course, to actually be able to influence policymakers and address some of the sort of budget issues, budget allocation issues that they are interested in influencing. Now, this partly might seem not very encouraging because you say there's only so much that a budget organization can do, But actually we saw that in the cases where a higher level of impact was achieved, organizations shared a number of characteristics, and these had to do with a sort of a more sophisticated approach that linked the research that they did with a more effective advocacy strategy and with coalition building, meaning working with other partners. And this links to another one, the third of the findings that I want to talk about, which is could be summarized in the sentence, it's all about relationships. I mean, we identified a series of, say, external constraining factors in terms of what civil society organizations could do. We also identified a number of internal characteristics that some of these organizations shared, but at the end of the day, one of the key drivers of, say, their capacity to actually have an influence on budget processes and policies was how able they were to establish good, strong relationships with a wide range of actors. So not only with other civil society organizations that had strengths that were complementary to their own, but also with key actors within government, within different parts of government, within the executive, the legislative, and the audit side of the budget, of budget institutions, and most importantly, probably with media organizations that were able to sort of take some of their messages and put more public pressure on the government, pushing for the changes that they were interested in. A fourth lesson had to do with what might be called the let's say the budget work mantra somehow, which has to do with the three terms: accuracy, timeliness, and accessibility, which Mark has also mentioned in his presentation. First of all, the budget information that civil society, that the 6 organizations that we looked at have to produce needs to be accurate. It needs to be accurate in terms of being evidence-based and in terms of providing non-controversial, non-disputable information when they sit down with government counterparts and actually argue their case. Second of all, it needs to be produced in a timely manner so that it fits in terms of influencing the right point of the policy cycle where they think they can reach maximum impact. And thirdly, it needs to be accessible in the sense that it needs to be able to speak the language of the audience that it's targeting. If it's say, addressed to community groups, then it needs to speak the language of community groups. If it's addressed to Ministry of Finance officials, then it needs to be it needs to use a very specific language. Finally, the last issue in terms of wider findings and lessons that I'd like to touch upon is the issue of capacity and leadership. Budget organizations are an interesting breed, one could say, because of the kind of skills that they require. Not only in terms of the technical skills that the analysts need to have in order to crunch the numbers that come from budget documents, but also in terms of, especially at the level of the leadership, being able to combine sort of strong analytical, strong research skills with strong advocacy skills in order to be able to spread the message and link up with other actors that can help them reach maximum impact. And what we found was that so the most successful organizations were the ones that were able to recruit good capacity, train internal capacity, retain internal capacity. That's the key issue, because often, since budget analysis skills are quite are not very common, then often what happens is that the ministries of finance actually poach some of the best analysts that these civil society organizations had trained, leaving them without too much internal capacity. And certainly a few of them went through some leadership struggle when maybe some of the historical, charismatic individuals who were capable of combining the research and the advocacy moved on to some other work and left the void to be filled. So, in a sense, those 5 main headings, the diversity of environments, institutional forms and approaches, the fact that you need a sophisticated approach to reach more long-term changes in budget policies, the importance of relationships, the budget work mantra of accuracy, timeliness, and accessibility, and the issues related to capacity and leadership were the 5 sort of main headings of things that we thought were useful, not only for other budget groups that are interested in engaging in this kind of work, but also for organizations interested in supporting them. And this links to my second point, which is about the role of donors. And here I just want to make a couple of very brief points that came out of some of the work that we did for the case studies, but also of some more sort of general reflections. The first point is about the role of donors in supporting governments open up to civil society. So it's really about what donors can do to influence the choices that aid-receiving governments make in order to allow them to sort of push for the transparency and accountability that civil society organizations are also pushing for. So there's an issue about donor governments putting pressure on recipient governments in order to make as much budget information available to the public as possible. There's an issue about donor agencies giving broad support not just to the government in terms of being able to produce better budget information, but also to other institutions that are sort of belong to the budget accountability system, such as parliaments, audit institutions, and again, so of course, civil society and the media, for example. But also there's an issue about donor agencies being more transparent themselves. Oftentimes, the support that donor agencies give to low-income countries is not easily capturable in recipient country budget system, which reduces the overall degree of transparency and makes domestic accountability more difficult. And the final 2 points about the role that donors can play in supporting civil society budget work, first of all, has to do with the nature of budget work. As I said, it's long-term in its nature. It needs to build substantial internal capacity within the organization, and it is based on a sophisticated approach, on a programmatic vision of what the organization needs to achieve. Of course, if an organization like that receives very fragmented project funding that doesn't, let's say, doesn't give any flexibility for the core support in terms of training and retaining internal capacity, and doesn't give sort of a long enough time horizon that allows for a more strategic approach, then that creates problems for the effectiveness of budget work. Therefore, point number one is about the provision of long-term programmatic funding to these kinds of organizations. The second one is about how to sort of select the best possible organizations that can be most effective. And the three issues that we looked at in terms of donor selection criteria for support to civil society budget work. One is the existence of a credible advocacy strategy that sort of links up the work of the organization with the work of other organizations working in similar areas. The second one is about linkages and networks, and how the organization has been or intends to build linkages with different kinds of actors within government, outside government, in broader civil society, within the media, and so on. And finally,